plague didn't kill half of Europe. Medieval DNA just shattered everything we thought we knew about history's deadliest pandemic. What scientists found lurking in 700-year-old bones will make you question if we've been blaming the wrong culprit this entire time. You know what's funny about history class? They always made the Black Death sound like some mysterious medieval monster that just showed up one day and decided to ruin everyone's Tuesday. Well, turns out our teachers were only half right about the mysterious part. Here's the thing that'll blow your mind. Scientists just cracked open some 800-year-old teeth like tiny time capsules. And what they found inside? DNA evidence that completely rewrites everything we thought we knew about what actually killed half of Europe. Think about it. 25 million people didn't just vanish because of bad luck or angry gods. That's like wiping out the entire population of Texas twice over. But here's where it gets really wild. It wasn't just one killer doing all the dirty work. For decades, historians have been playing detective with incomplete evidence. Sort of like trying to solve a murder mystery when half the witness statements are written in a language nobody speaks anymore. Pretty frustrating, right? But modern science just handed us the missing pieces. These researchers extracted DNA from medieval dental pulp, basically the inside of ancient teeth, and discovered something incredible. The Black Death wasn't flying solo. We're talking about a whole gang of microscopic thugs working together like some kind of medieval crime syndicate, each one deadlier than your mother-in-law's meatloaf and twice as persistent. The breakthrough came when scientists realized they could read genetic signatures left behind by these ancient pathogens. It's like finding fingerprints at a crime scene, except the crime scene is 7 centuries old and buried 6 feet underground. What they discovered changes everything. This wasn't just bubonic plague having a bad day and deciding to tour Europe. Oh no, this was an orchestrated assault involving multiple diseases that hit medieval Europe like a perfect storm of microscopic mayhem. The numbers are staggering when you really think about them. In some regions, up to 60% of the population just disappeared. That's more devastating than any war, earthquake, or natural disaster in recorded history. And the weirdest part? These pathogens had been quietly evolving and plotting their European vacation for centuries before they actually made their move. But before we dive into the main villain of this medieval horror show, the infamous Yersinia pestis, there's something you need to understand about how these ancient bacteria turned an entire continent into their personal playground. The smoking gun in this medieval murder mystery? A bacterium with a name that sounds like a sneeze. Yersinia pestis. This microscopic menace is what we now call the bubonic plague, and boy, did it know how to make an entrance. Here's where it gets interesting. Scientists extracted DNA from medieval teeth, yes, teeth, and found this little troublemaker hiding in there like evidence at a crime scene. Think of those teeth as tiny time capsules, preserving the genetic fingerprints of history's most wanted killer. But here's the kicker. Yersinia pestis didn't just waltz into Europe on its own. It hitched rides on fleas, who in turn caught lifts on rats. Makes sense, right? It's like the world's deadliest carpool system, except nobody asked for the ride. Now, I've dealt with fleas on my old dog Buster, and let me tell you, those little jumpers are persistent. But medieval fleas, they were basically flying syringes loaded with death. One bite from an infected flea, and you'd develop those infamous black swellings called buboes, hence bubonic plague. Charming name for such an ugly way to go. The DNA evidence shows this bacterium was incredibly efficient. We're talking death rates of up to 60% in some areas. That's like losing 6 out of every 10 people in your neighborhood bridge club. Absolutely devastating. Well, here's something that'll make your skin crawl. The plague bacterium actually evolved as it spread across Europe. Scientists can track these genetic changes like following breadcrumbs, except these breadcrumbs led to mass graves instead of gingerbread houses. What really gets me is how perfectly adapted this killer was. Yersinia pestis could survive in flea guts, multiply in rat blood, and absolutely wreck human immune systems. It's like nature's own biological weapon, designed with diabolical precision. The medieval folks had no idea what hit them. They blamed everything from bad air to angry gods, while this microscopic assassin quietly rewrote European demographics. Towns that took centuries to build were emptied in months. But, And here's where our story takes an even darker turn. New DNA evidence reveals that Yersinia pestis wasn't working alone. This bacterial bad boy had accomplices, other diseases that tag-teamed medieval Europe into submission. The plague was brutal enough on its own, killing millions with ruthless efficiency. Yet scientists discovered something that makes this medieval nightmare even more terrifying than we thought. Now here's where things get really messy. The Black Death wasn't some lone wolf prowling through Europe. It brought friends to the party. And trust me, these weren't the kind of guests you'd want showing up at your medieval doorstep. While Yersinia pestis was busy being the star of this horror show, smallpox decided to crash the party too. Makes sense, right? Why let one disease have all the fun when you can turn Europe into a pathogen playground? Smallpox had been around for centuries, but during the 14th century, it seemed to sense opportunity knocking. Then there's typhoid fever, sliding into towns like that relative who always shows up when things are already going wrong. This sneaky killer spread through contaminated water and food, which, let's be honest, wasn't exactly hard to find in medieval Europe. Their idea of food safety was basically, if it doesn't smell too bad, it's probably fine. But wait, there's more. Influenza strains were also making their rounds, and these weren't your modern take 2 aspirin and call me in the morning variety. We're talking about flu viruses that could knock out entire households faster than you could say, God bless you. The medieval immune system was about as prepared for this assault as a paper umbrella in a hurricane. Well, here's the kicker. Recent DNA evidence shows these diseases weren't just taking turns politely. They were tag-teaming entire populations. Scientists found traces of multiple pathogens in the same burial sites, proving that people weren't just dealing with one illness. They were getting hit by what researchers now call a disease syndemic, basically a perfect storm of microscopic mayhem. And the weird part is, each disease made the others worse. Smallpox would weaken someone's immune system, making them perfect targets for the plague. The flu would leave people bedridden and vulnerable to typhoid. It was like a medieval medical nightmare, where every door you opened led to another monster. Climate records from ice cores show that Europe was also dealing with unusually cold, wet weather during this period. Crops failed, people were malnourished, and their bodies couldn't fight off infections. Mother Nature apparently decided to pile on too. Let's not forget that medieval folks had zero understanding of germ theory. Their best medical advice was usually bleed the patient or pray harder. About as effective as treating a house fire with a squirt gun. But how did all these diseases manage to coordinate such a devastating attack across an entire continent? The answer lies in the ancient highways of death that connected east to west. Now here's where things get really wild. The Black Death didn't just magically appear in London or Paris one Tuesday morning. Nope. This microscopic nightmare had quite the travel itinerary, and boy did it take the scenic route. Central Asia was ground zero for this bacterial bonanza. Think of it as the world's worst travel agency, specializing in death-dealing vacation packages. The steppes of Mongolia and Kazakhstan were brewing up pathogen cocktails that would make a bartender jealous if bartenders mixed deadly diseases instead of martinis. But here's the kicker. Those same trade routes that brought Europe silk, spices, and exotic goods, well, they also delivered a special bonus nobody ordered. The Silk Road was basically operating as a medieval Amazon Prime, except instead of next-day delivery, you got plague-carrying fleas with a lifetime guarantee. DNA evidence now shows us exactly how these microscopic hitchhikers made their grand tour across continents. It's like following breadcrumbs, except the breadcrumbs are ancient bacteria hiding in 600-year-old teeth. Makes you grateful for modern dental hygiene, right? The spread pattern is absolutely fascinating. Scientists tracked the genetic mutations of Yersinia pestis as it hopped from caravan to caravan, city to city. Each stop along the way left its bacterial signature, like a really morbid passport stamp collection. What's truly mind-boggling is how efficiently these pathogens traveled. No jet planes, no cruise ships, just merchants, their goods, and unfortunately, their four-legged rodent companions. Rats were essentially running a medieval Uber service for fleas, except the destination was always mass extinction. The timing couldn't have been worse for Europe. Trade was booming. Cities were growing, and people were packed together like sardines in increasingly crowded urban centers. It was basically a bacterial buffet with all-you-can-infect dining. Then there's the climate factor nobody talks about. The medieval warm period was ending, temperatures were dropping, and crop failures were already weakening populations. Hungry people make excellent hosts for the disease. Their immune systems were already waving white flags before the real battle began. Recent DNA analysis reveals multiple waves of infection followed these trade corridors. It wasn't just one plague hitting Europe. It was like a relay race where each runner carried increasingly deadly batons across thousands of miles. The most chilling part? Medieval people had absolutely no idea what was coming their way. They were essentially sitting ducks in a shooting gallery, completely unaware that death was methodically working its way westward, one trade stop at a time. But the journey itself was only half the story. Once these diseases reached Europe's crowded cities and towns, they found the perfect conditions to really show off their deadly potential. The medieval plague wasn't just about diseased rats scurrying through cobblestone streets. Nope. The real horror story involves an entire cast of unwitting accomplices that turned Europe into one giant disease highway. Let's start with the obvious suspects. Rats. These furry little troublemakers didn't exactly pack their bags and decide to tour Europe. They hitched rides on merchant ships, trading vessels, and grain carts like medieval hitchhikers from hell. But here's where it gets interesting. The rats weren't even the main villains. The real culprits? Fleas. Think of them as tiny disease-carrying Ubers, hopping from rat to rat, then from rat to human. These microscopic menaces had zero customer service skills and a 100% infection rate. When their rat host died, they simply switched to the next available meal ticket, which happened to be humans. Well, it gets worse. Medieval hygiene standards made today's teenagers look like germaphobes. People rarely bathed, wore the same clothes for months, and thought changing underwear was optional. Actually, most folks didn't even own underwear. This created 5-star accommodations for fleas and their equally disgusting cousins, body lice. But humans weren't just passive victims in this biological nightmare. They became walking disease delivery systems themselves. Picture medieval Europe as the world's deadliest game of tag, except nobody wanted to be it. Infected people traveled between towns for markets, religious festivals, and family visits, spreading death faster than gossip at a church social. And the weird part is, medieval folks had no clue they were participating in this deadly relay race. They blamed everything from bad air to angry gods, while completely missing the microscopic murder spree happening right under their unwashed noses. Trade routes made everything worse. The famous Silk Road might as well have been called the Death Highway. Merchants unknowingly transported infected fleas, rats, and contaminated goods across thousands of miles. It was like Amazon Prime for pathogen. Fast, efficient, and absolutely everywhere. Dense city populations turned into perfect breeding grounds for these disease carriers. Imagine cramming your entire neighborhood into your garage, then adding rats, fleas, and medieval sanitation standards. Makes sense, right? The result was a biological powder keg, waiting to explode. This deadly delivery network ultimately reshaped European civilization, killing roughly 25 million people through sheer biological efficiency. Then there's something even more sinister that medieval Europeans never saw coming. Silent killers lurking in their daily water supply. Well, while everyone was busy watching out for rats and fleas, death was literally flowing right under their noses. Medieval Europe had another killer that nobody talks about much. Contaminated water that turned every sip into a potential death sentence. Here's what the DNA scientists found buried in those old medieval latrines. And trust me, digging through ancient toilets for clues takes dedication. They discovered nasty bacterial strains like Shigella and E. coli that were having an absolute field day in towns already getting hammered by the plague. It's like these waterborne bugs looked at Europe and said, "Hey, looks like a good time to join the party." The contaminated wells were basically biological weapons in disguise. Towns that should have been safe havens became outbreak zones faster than you could say, "pass the chamber pot." Makes you appreciate modern plumbing, doesn't it? But here's where it gets really grim. During medieval sieges, when armies surrounded cities, the trapped people inside had to drink whatever water they could find. Spoiler alert, it wasn't exactly bottled spring water. These sieges often ended not because the walls were breached, but because everyone inside had died from drinking polluted water. Talk about winning by default. The mortality records tell an even more heartbreaking story. In some regions, these invisible water assassins were actually killing more children than the famous Black Death itself. While adults might survive a bout of dysentery, though they'd wish they hadn't, kids didn't stand much of a chance. The cruel irony? Water was supposed to be life-giving. Instead, medieval Europeans were basically playing Russian roulette every time they got thirsty. No wonder they preferred ale for breakfast. It was safer than water. Scientists now believe these waterborne diseases were like the backup singers in a death metal band. They might not have gotten top billing like the plague, but they were absolutely essential to the devastating performance that wiped out half of Europe. These microscopic killers worked behind the scenes, amplifying death tolls far beyond what any flea or rat could manage alone. They turned basic human needs into deadly gambles. Well, if you think contaminated water was bad, wait until you hear about what happened before these diseases even showed up. There was something that made Europeans sitting ducks for every single pathogen that came their way. Before any plague rat ever set foot in Europe, something far more sinister had already begun its deadly work. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1317 didn't just leave people hungry, it turned an entire continent into sitting ducks. You know how your grandmother always said you can't fight off a cold when you're run down? Well, she was on to something bigger than she realized. When the rain started in 1314, nobody thought much of it. Rain's good for crops, right? Wrong. These weren't gentle spring showers. We're talking about biblical downpours that lasted for months. Crops rotted in the fields. Livestock drowned. Salt production stopped because you can't evaporate seawater when it won't stop raining. By 1315, people were eating tree bark and boiling leather shoes for soup. And I thought my college diet was bad. But here's where it gets really grim. Recent DNA analysis from skeletal remains shows something terrifying. Widespread immune system collapse. When your body's running on empty for the years, it can't fight off anything. A simple cold becomes pneumonia. A small cut turns gangrenous. Your body basically waves the white flag. The famine didn't just kill people outright, though it killed plenty. Conservative estimates put the death toll at 10% of Europe's population. That's around 7 million people who starved to death. But the real killer was what came after. Those who survived were walking disasters waiting to happen. Their bones show signs of chronic malnutrition, anemia, and vitamin deficiencies that would last for years. These weren't just thin people. They were human beings whose immune systems had been systematically destroyed. Then, there's the psychological damage. Cannibalism became so common that churches started preaching specifically against it. Parents abandoned children they couldn't feed. Entire villages turned into ghost towns before any plague ever arrived. Medieval chroniclers wrote about people so weak they couldn't bury their own dead. Mass graves from this period show bodies stacked like cordwood, with no ceremony, no respect, just desperate attempts to prevent more disease. When the Black Death finally hit in 1347, it wasn't attacking healthy populations. It was attacking communities that had been systematically weakened for 30 years. The famine had created perfect conditions, crowded urban areas where rural refugees had fled, populations with compromised immune systems, and social structures already on the brink of collapse. Historians now call the famine the Great Primer. It set the stage for what would become medieval Europe's greatest nightmare. But even as communities struggled to recover from starvation, another silent killer was already spreading through the crowded, unwashed masses. While everyone talks about the Black Death and famine, there's another killer that flew under the radar for centuries. Makes sense, right? Epidemic typhus doesn't exactly roll off the tongue like bubonic plague. But here's the kicker. Recent DNA evidence shows this forgotten fever was butchering entire communities across medieval Europe. Scientists found Rickettsia prowazekii lurking in ancient remains, and suddenly the death toll puzzle started making a lot more sense. Well, typhus had the perfect accomplice: body lice. These tiny hitchhikers turned every crowded monastery, prison, and army camp into a death trap. Think your family reunion gets uncomfortable when everyone's packed together? Try sharing a medieval monastery dormitory where nobody's bathed in months and lice are having the time of their lives. The symptoms were absolutely brutal: violent fever that could cook your brain, angry red rashes spreading like wildfire, and delirium that made people act like they'd lost their marbles completely. One day you're copying manuscripts, the next you're raving about dragons in the scriptures. But why was typhus so devastating? Timing, my friend. Pure, deadly timing. This sneaky disease had a habit of showing up right when communities were already on their knees from famine or plague. It's like getting kicked when you're already down, except the kick might actually kill you. Historical records show typhus waves overlapping with plague cycles, creating back-to-back catastrophes that left towns looking like ghost stories. And the weird part is, we almost missed this entirely. For centuries, historians blamed everything on the plague and called it a day. But modern DNA sequencing revealed typhus DNA in medieval skeletons from monasteries to military camps. Turns out, this lice-borne nightmare was working overtime during Europe's darkest hours. Medieval armies were particularly vulnerable. Soldiers packed together like sardines, rarely washing, sharing everything from blankets to bad luck. When typhus hit a military camp, it spread faster than gossip at a church social. Entire battalions would collapse, not from enemy swords, but from microscopic invaders they couldn't even see. Then there were the monasteries. Those supposed safe havens became typhus breeding grounds. Monks living in close quarters, following vows of poverty that apparently included avoiding soap, created perfect conditions for lice to throw their own deadly parties. The really sobering truth? Historians now believe typhus contributed massively to Europe's staggering death toll during the medieval period. This rediscovered fever, hiding in plain sight for 700 years, was quietly helping to kill half a continent. Sometimes the most dangerous enemies are the ones nobody talks about.